There's something you do every single day that you've never questioned. Not because it doesn't bother you, but because everyone around you does it too, and that made it feel safe. It feels like just living, like being a normal person in a modern world. But Carl Rogers spent decades studying what happens inside a human being when they stop being honest with themselves. And what he found wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a breakdown. It was something quieter, something that accumulates. He called it incongruence, the gap between who you actually are and who you've learned to perform. And that gap, it costs you something real. Not all at once, but slowly, in ways you stop noticing because you've adapted to the weight. Think about that for a moment. You adapt to the weight. That's what happens. The discomfort doesn't disappear. You just stop registering it as discomfort. You start registering it as normal. And normal is the most dangerous word in this conversation, because normal doesn't mean healthy. It means familiar. It means shared. It means no one around you is pointing at it and saying something is wrong. So here's the question beneath this video. What if the most dangerous habits aren't the obvious ones, but the ones that feel completely normal? The first one is something you probably did within the last hour. You checked what other people think before you decided what you think. Not consciously. You scrolled. You read the comments. You measured your reaction against the reactions of strangers before you allowed yourself to feel anything clearly. Rogers had a name for this pattern: living from the outside in. When your sense of what's real, what matters, what's worth feeling, is permanently rented from external approval. And it's not just social media, it runs deeper than that. It shows up in how you dress for an event you're not even excited about, in how you word a text so it lands the way it needs to land, in how you hold your opinion back just long enough to gauge the room before offering it. That's not social awareness. That's the habit of never fully trusting your own interior experience as a valid source of information about the world. And the brain learns this. It rewires around it. It starts producing anxiety before opinions, not after them. It learns to wait, to outsource the first draft of reality to everyone else. It stops trusting itself. And when the brain stops trusting itself, it doesn't announce it loudly. It just becomes very, very tired. Every small decision starts to feel heavier than it should. Because the mechanism you were built to use, your own felt sense of things, has been quietly sidelined for so long that it's barely in the conversation anymore. The second habit hides behind something that sounds like self-discipline. You stay busy, always, relentlessly. There's always a task, a notification, a reason to be occupied. And productivity culture tells you this is a virtue, that doing more means being more. But Rogers observed something different in the people who came to him. The ones who couldn't stop filling their time weren't building anything. They were avoiding something, because stillness is where you meet yourself. And meeting yourself when you haven't done it in a while is deeply uncomfortable. There's a specific kind of dread that comes right before real stillness. It surfaces the moment a drive ends and you haven't reached for your phone yet. It shows up in the seconds between finishing one thing and starting another. A faint but persistent sense that if you stopped, really stopped, something you haven't dealt with might surface. And so you don't stop. You optimize your busyness instead. You find better productivity systems, cleaner to-do lists, more efficient ways to stay in motion. You get very good at directed activity as a substitute for actual presence. The brain needs rest to consolidate experience, to integrate emotion, to make meaning out of what happened. When you never stop, when you never give it that space, it processes nothing. It accumulates everything. And accumulated, unprocessed experience doesn't stay quiet forever. It shows up as irritability without a clear source, as sadness that arrives on a Sunday afternoon for no reason you can name, as the strange flatness that settles in after a genuinely good moment because you couldn't quite let it be real while it was happening. If you've ever felt exhausted without knowing why, or empty despite having done everything right, that might be exactly what this looks like from the inside. And if something here is already resonating, quietly, like a recognition, this channel exists for moments like this. You're not alone in this kind of searching. The third habit is one that gets praised. You've learned to be fine, really, impressively fine. You answer good before anyone finishes asking. You minimize what's difficult. You reframe the hard things quickly before they settle. This is what Rogers called conditions of worth, the unspoken agreements you made early in your life about which parts of you were acceptable and which ones needed to disappear. Those agreements weren't made consciously. They were made in small moments. In the times when you cried and the room became uncomfortable. In the times when your anger was treated as a problem to be solved rather than a feeling to be understood. In the times when being vulnerable made things worse, not better. And so you learned. You learned which emotions were safe to have and which ones needed to be managed before they became visible. And the parts that disappeared didn't actually go anywhere. They went underground. They went into the body. They went into the low-grade tension you carry in your shoulders, in the tightness in your chest when something touches too close. The brain doesn't forget what the mouth learned to deny. The nervous system keeps a record that the performance of fine never erases. And the cost of maintaining that performance, of holding yourself together in a way that looks effortless, is a level of background exhaustion that doesn't respond to sleep, to vacation, to any of the things that should help. Because the problem isn't rest. The problem is that a significant portion of your energy is allocated every single day to keeping certain truths invisible. The fourth habit is so embedded in modern life that naming it feels almost unfair. You live in constant partial attention. Conversations where you're half present. Meals consumed while watching something else. Evenings that passed but you couldn't tell someone what happened in them. And this isn't just about screens. Those screens have made it easier. This is about the way the modern mind has learned to skim the surface of its own experience. To touch everything briefly and nothing deeply. To move through hours the way you scroll through a feed. Quickly, lightly, without landing anywhere long enough to feel it. Attention is how the brain assigns meaning. When something gets your full attention, the mind marks it as real, as significant, as worth encoding. When everything receives a fraction of your attention, everything becomes equally forgettable, equally thin. And people who live this way don't just lose memories. They start to lose the sense that their own life is actually happening to them. They describe it in different ways, feeling like a spectator in their own story, like life is passing while they watch it from behind glass, like time is moving faster than they can inhabit it. That's not a metaphor. That's a real perceptual shift that happens when presence becomes chronically unavailable. The mind loses its grip on the texture of its own experience. And without that texture, without that felt sense of being here, in this moment, living, meaning starts to erode. Not dramatically, just gradually, like color fading in a photograph that's been left too long in the light. The fifth one is something you learned so young you don't remember learning it. You adapted yourself to fit the mood of the room. You became a little quieter when someone needed you to be. A little more agreeable when disagreement felt dangerous. You learned which version of you was welcomed, and you led with that version, every time. And somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like adaptation. It started feeling like personality. Like just who you are. The accommodating one. The low-maintenance one. The one who doesn't make it complicated. Rogers called the authentic self the organism. The part of you that knows what it needs, what it feels, what it wants, before all the social editing begins. And the more consistently you override that organism, the more it begins to feel like a stranger inside you. Not a dramatic split, just a quiet distance. A sense that you're performing your life rather than inhabiting it. And the people who love you, the ones who think they know you, they know the edited version, the curated one. The one that learned to stay welcome. And there's a particular loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who genuinely care about you and still feeling fundamentally unseen. Not because they failed to look, but because you learned a long time ago to show them a version of yourself that was easier to hold. That loneliness doesn't announce itself as loneliness. It announces itself as a vague sense that something is missing, as the feeling that even your closest relationships don't quite reach you, as the quiet suspicion that you have never quite been fully known by anyone, including yourself. This might be the right moment to pause, not to absorb a list, but to ask yourself with real honesty, when was the last time you did something purely because it was true to you? Not strategic, not approved, not earned. If you find yourself here often in these kinds of questions, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing in the comments. What's the habit you've normalized that you suspect might be costing you the most? There are people reading those comments who need to know they're not alone in what they're carrying. The sixth habit lives inside something that looks like responsibility. You make decisions by eliminating options that could lead to regret, not by moving toward what genuinely calls you. This is fear-based navigation, and the brain, wired to avoid threat, will cooperate with it completely. It will build an entire architecture of rationalization around staying small, staying safe, staying within the perimeter of what's already been approved by your life so far. And it's subtle. It doesn't feel like fear most of the time. It feels like being realistic. It feels like maturity. Like you've simply learned what the world is actually like and adjusted accordingly. Like you've outgrown the naive version of yourself that wanted things without a risk assessment attached. But there's a difference between wisdom and contraction, between healthy discernment and the slow, habitual shrinking of what you allow yourself to want. Rogers believed human beings have a natural movement toward growth. He called it the actualizing tendency, not ambition, not achievement. Something more fundamental, the pull toward becoming more fully what you already are. When you consistently override that pull with risk management, something in you goes quiet, not all at once, but eventually you stop hearing it. The yearning doesn't disappear, it goes underground. It becomes nostalgia for a life you haven't lived yet. It becomes the particular ache of watching someone else do the thing you told yourself wasn't practical. It becomes the question that surfaces at 2 a.m. when the mental management breaks down and something more honest gets through. And mistaking that silence for peace is one of the quietest tragedies of adult life. Because the absence of want doesn't mean contentment. Sometimes it just means the wanting went somewhere you stopped checking. The seventh habit is the one that makes all the others possible. You've stopped questioning the self you've become, not out of arrogance, but out of exhaustion. Out of the kind of resignation that sets in when examining your own patterns feels like too much, when the distance between who you are and who you sense you could be feels too wide to cross. So you maintain, you perform consistency. You protect the identity you've constructed, even when it no longer fits, because dismantling it feels like loss. And to be fair, it is a kind of loss. Every time you genuinely grow, some version of you has to be released. The self-concept, that layered story you carry about who you are, what you're capable of, what you deserve, doesn't update automatically. It has to be actively, sometimes painfully revised. Most people don't do that revision. Not because they don't sense it's needed, but because the self you know, even when it's limiting, feels safer than the self you might discover if you looked honestly. There's a strange comfort in the familiar cage, but Rogers saw something in his work that changed the way he understood people. He saw that the self-concept, the story we carry about who we are, is not the same as the self. It's a map, and maps can be outdated. The territory shifts. You change, whether you notice it or not. You accumulate experience that doesn't fit the old story. You develop edges and depths and contradictions that the earlier version of the map never accounted for. The person who holds their map too tightly never discovers that the territory shifted. They spend their energy defending the accuracy of a document that stopped describing them years ago. And the cost of that defense, the energy required to keep old conclusions intact against the quiet pressure of new experience, is enormous. It's invisible, but enormous. None of what was said here is meant to become a new burden, another thing to fix, another dimension of failure. That's not what this is. Because here's what Rogers came to understand, and what made his work so quietly revolutionary. It wasn't that people needed to be pushed harder toward change. It wasn't that the answer was more discipline, more insight, more ruthless self-examination. It was almost the opposite. He found that when people felt genuinely accepted, not evaluated, not advised, not fixed, something in them relaxed enough to begin moving on its own. When the conditions were safe enough to stop performing, the organism began to reveal itself. And what it revealed was not the broken, shameful thing that people feared. It was something closer to aliveness. What Rogers pointed toward, over and over, in patient after patient, in year after year of sitting with people in their confusion, was something almost shockingly simple. That the movement toward wholeness isn't a destination you reach. It's a direction you orient yourself toward. That becoming more fully yourself doesn't require becoming someone better. It requires becoming more honest, more present, more willing to feel what's actually there, instead of the edited version. It doesn't start with a plan. It starts with noticing. Noticing that you checked external approval before forming your own reaction. Noticing that you stayed busy past the point of productivity into something more like hiding. Noticing that you said fine when fine wasn't the truth, and that a small part of you registered the distance between those two things. Noticing is not the same as fixing. Noticing is just turning the light on. And something important happens when you simply turn the light on, without immediately reaching for the nearest solution. The part of you that's been performing gets to rest for a moment. The part that's been waiting, the one that knows what you actually feel, what you actually need, what you are actually like when no one's watching, that part gets a little more room to breathe. With sitting, even briefly, with the discomfort of what's true before rushing to fix it. With letting yourself be a little more real than yesterday, not for anyone else, but because you are worth that kind of attention from yourself. That's where it begins, not in a resolution. Not in a system. In a small, quiet act of turning toward your own experience with a little more gentleness than you have been. And maybe that's enough for right now. Not the whole journey, just the first honest look at where you actually are. That's not small. That takes something. More than most people give themselves credit for. Because it's easier to keep scrolling, keep optimizing, keep performing fine. It's easier to live inside the map than to look up and notice how different the territory has become. But you're here, you watch this. Something in you is willing to look. That's not nothing. That's actually where it starts. If something in this video stirred something in you, if a word landed somewhere specific, write it in the comments. Not for the algorithm. Because articulating what you're beginning to understand is part of how understanding deepens. Saying it out loud, even in text, to strangers who can't see your face, changes something about how clearly you can see it yourself. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into this kind of work. Leave a like if this reached somewhere real. And share it with someone who might need to hear that what they're quietly carrying has a name. This channel is built for the kind of person who won't stop asking real questions about who they actually are. You belong here.